Today we're going to move on to our first system review, and we're actually going to review two systems. We're going to review the integumentary system and the skeletal system. The integumentary system, as I said before last week, is the skin and skin appendages. The integumentary system includes the sweat glands, the hair, and the nails, and we will talk about all of these in some detail in the coming slides. Integumentary system, the skin itself can be quite thin in some places, measuring only 0.02 inches thick, and quite thick in other areas, measuring 0.2 inches thick. The areas of the thinnest skin tend to be in areas that do not experience a lot of trauma, like your eyelids, whereas the areas of the thickest skin tend to experience a lot of trauma, including the palms, the hands, and the soles of the feet. As we said last week, the skin functions to protect us against infection, to keep fluid in and keep other fluids out, to regulate temperature, and also as part of the sensory perception of touch. Now, the integumentary system is separated into layers. There are actually three major layers of the skin. The epidermis is the outer portion of the skin. It is formed by epithelial tissue that attaches to the dermis. The dermis is the dense, irregular connective tissue that forms the deeper layers of skin. Actually, some people do not consider the third layer a layer of skin, but it's called the hypodermis. The hypodermis is loose connective tissue that is under the dermis and connects the tissue to the bone and underlying muscle. Now, the dermis is separated into two layers. The top layer, or the layer of the dermis that's closest to the epidermis, is called the papillary layer. And that's because it is interspaced with these involutions called papillae, dermal papillae. And so this part of the dermis is called the papillary layer of the dermis. Underneath the papillary layer is the reticular dermis. In addition, the epidermal layer has ridges, which we know as fingerprints. And the ridges are there to help us with grasping, although we can also use them to identify people because every individual has a different fingerprint. Even identical twins that have the same DNA have different fingerprints. The reticular layer is underneath the papillary layer, and it's a network of collagen fibers that gives strength and allows, and these collagen fibers are in all directions, so it allows stretching in all directions without tearing. Now, this diagram shows what's known as the lines of tension. These lines point in the general direction of the collagen that is in the dermis. If you cut parallel to these lines, then the healing generally occurs without scarring, and there's not a pulling against the healing. However, if you cut perpendicular to these lines, then there's a natural pulling that occurs that causes an increased scarring. And these lines are particularly important to plastic surgeons who try to decrease the scar formation that occurs when they do their surgery. Now, I'm going to take this diagram and use this to point out several anatomic features of the skin. This arrow now points to the hair inside a hair follicle. These little glands right here that are up against the hair are called sebaceous glands. They produce a material called sebum, which waterproofs and keeps the skin supple. You see underneath in the subcutaneous layer, the hypodermis, is the blood vessels, the artery, which is in red, and the vein, which is in blue. You see this nerve ending that can actually go on up into the dermal area, which is why you can feel pain all the way into the dermal layer. And this little bulb here is called a Passacean corpuscle, which actually senses pressure. This is the sweat gland here, the sweat duct, and the sweat pore here. And as I said, this is the epidermal layer, the dermal layer, and the hypodermis or reticular layer. Now this is called the arrector pili. This muscle actually can change the orientation of the hair and cause the hair to stand up. Now the most serious injury to the skin is a burn. And burns are measured by their depth into the skin, or the depth of damage that occurs. A first-degree burn is limited to the epidermis, as shown here, and usually results in a reddening of the skin like a sunburn. A sunburn is generally a first-degree burn. If the burn extends into the dermal layer, then it is called a second-degree burn and is usually associated with blistering. So you have these bullae that occur that have fluid inside. If the full thickness of the skin is damaged, then this is called a third-degree burn. This is most severe and is most significant because generally with first and second-degree burns, healing can occur without scarring, but in third-degree burns, healing does not occur well. Commonly, skin grafting has to be performed in order to restore the coverage, depending on how big the burn is. Now, as I said, this muscle right here can change the orientation of the hair, and this muscle is called the arrector pili. And the purpose of that is to notify, in animals anyway, it's to notify the animals around that the animal is upset or afraid. It generally occurs when an animal is getting ready to fight or flee, the fight or flight reflex. In humans, it has less important purpose. The sweat gland, as I pointed out before, is here or here, and it produces a fluid, a liquid fluid, that is pumped out onto the skin and decreases the temperature. The sebaceous glands are up against the hair follicle. They secrete an oily substance that lubricates and waterproofs the skin and keeps the skin supple. Now the epidermis is actually 5 layers thick, and we'll go through those 5 layers very briefly. The basal layer, which is right next to the basement membrane, is the first layer of skin, or the deepest layer of skin, and this layer of skin undergoes active mitosis to help replace the skin as it sloughs off at the top. The stratum spinosum is the next layer of skin. It's called stratum spinosum because there are spiny processes on the cells. And in the stratum spinosum is where you find the melanocytes, which give people the skin color. It's thicker than the basal layer, and it also continues to undergo mitosis. The third layer of skin third layer of the epidermis is the granulosal layer, or stratum granulosum. It is called granulosum because these cells have granular inclusions in them. And at this point, they're beginning to produce keratin. At this point, the cells quit dividing and they begin to die. The next layer that we will be talking about is the stratum lucidum. It's only present in the thicker places of the skin, and it generally contains dead skin cells and keratin. And then the top layer is called the stratum corneum, containing ghost bodies of cells and keratin. Now when these top layers sloughs off, and they do this continually, when that top layer sloughs off, it's called desquamation. The flaking off of skin is called desquamation, and it occurs constantly as time passes. Now the melanocyte, as I said before, is in the basal layer and in the next layer, and it produces the color pigment that leads to the pigmentation of skin. And there are two types of color pigment. One is called eumelanin, which stands for true melanin. And the more of this that's present, the darker the skin is. And then there's pheomelanin, which is a red tintish color that occurs in some but not all individuals. Now what we have here are various types of cancers that occur in the skin. We have a squamous cancer, which begins in the surface area where the squamous cells are and can penetrate both down and up and results in a ulceration frequently when that occurs. The second type of cancer, and the most common, is called a basal cell carcinoma, which occurs in the basal layer and grows up from the basal layer until you have an ulcerated area in the top of the skin. Now both of these, if caught early, can result or can be treated with surgery. And then the third type of cancer is called a melanoma, which obviously is a cancer of the melanin or of the melanocyte. And again, they grow up and they're pigmented and they grow down. And what you see is the deeper it grows in this direction, the worse the prognosis is for the person that has this. And melanomas are by far the most dangerous of the three cancers of the skin. Now let's move on to hair. What we see here is a hair shaft. Hair shaft consists of three layers. The outer layer is called the cuticle. The inner layer, the middle, is called the cortex, and between those two is the medulla. The base of the hair is the root, and the base of the root is called the hair bulb. The hair grows within a small pocket that's called a follicle. And then in the lower part near the bulb is an area of undifferentiated cells called the matrix, which results in the growth of the hair. And here we have another picture looking at the hair. And the hair can either be undergoing growth, in which case it's called the growth stages, or it can be resting and not growing, in which case it's called a resting stage. And as I said before, you have the medulla, cortex, and the cuticle here of the hair itself. And then the outer wall or the shaft of the follicle is made up of an internal root sheath and the external root sheath, which are shown right here. And when you pull out the hair, sometimes you see this whitish material on the root, and that whitish material is the internal epithelial root sheath. Now we'll finish up our discussion of the skin and the integumentary system by talking about the nails. And we have two views of the nail, the lateral view here and the PA or on top view here. And the nail grows from an area called the nail matrix, and just like the hair matrix, the nail matrix consists of undifferentiated cells. Now this area right here, this is a thumb because it's easy to see. This is called the lacuna. Now the lacuna is where the matrix extends up where you can actually see it underneath the nail, and this part of the nail is thicker than the rest of the nail. So you have the nail matrix here, and if it extends up where you can see it, then that's called the lacuna. Nails are important for grasping. And then we can talk about the skin glands. We've mentioned these a couple of times already, but here's the sweat gland, and here are the sebaceous glands. The sweat gland is a American gland in most cases, which means it does not lose any of the cell itself. It merely secretes its material into the duct. But under the arm and in the pubic area, they become apocrine, which means they lose part of the cell in the process of secreting their material. The function of sweat glands is to cool the body. The sebaceous gland is a holocrine gland, which means the entire cell is lost in the process of secretion. And as I said, it produces a material known as sebum. Sebum is a waterproof material that acts like a hand cream, for lack of a better term, and works to keep the skin moist and lubricated. Now, there is a problem with sebum. If these ducts become blocked, and they can become infected, and this is what we know as a pimple or a zit, and this is the most common type of zit, is the infection of this area right here. And you frequently treat these infections with antibiotics and they clear up. But these have to become blocked in order for this to be infected.